Ölgen ko'chilarda Ümit üzme aziz xalqim Ümit üzme ey ana yurt Biz atlandık bu küreşke O yıl taştak uyuşup Allah verse bu nusretni Bizgilerimiz sep bulup Zalimlarni yığlatgudek Oğuz gibi küçlük bulup Lepildeydu asminimda Göz çaknitip şu günü Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım Ey ana makam Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to another episode of Talk East Turkestan. I have a very special guest with me joining us all the way from the London, UK. She is a professor in ethnomusicology at SOAS, the University of London, an expert in Uyghur expressive culture, politics of religion and heritage in China and Central Asia. So I'd like to introduce to our Talk to East Turkestan podcast today, whatever time zone you're watching it from. It's none other than Rachel Harris. Good afternoon to you over there, Rachel. How are you today?
Hi there, I'm great. Thank you. Nice to be with you.
You know, for the longest time, we've been talking about on our show the various politics and the physical side of things that's been happening to the Uyghurs. But I wanted to, you know, it's the start of the year. I wanted to go out on a more lighter note, talking about the Uyghur culture and how it has influenced, you know, humanity and how important it is. And basically, as the title suggests of our show today, China's war on Uyghur culture. So that's what we're going to focus on. But if you could just give us like a brief biography of yourself and how you got started and introduced to the Uyghur culture, what you love so much about it, and how important it is to you.
Oh, that's quite a long story already. You know, I started off studying Chinese at university, you know, and then I went backpacking a long time ago, and I traveled to the Uyghur homeland. I went to Urumqi and all the way to Kashgar. Oh, this was way back in like 1991, I think. And I became very fascinated by that area. I guess I thought it was exotic, you know, all these kind of stereotypes. I love the scenery, and I was already interested in music at that time, and I had some introductions from like Chinese musicologists, and so I traveled all the way through Urumqi, and Yerkent and Kashgar, and I met Muqam musicians there. I even went up all the way to Tashkurgan and heard the Tajik playing that kind of ney, you know, the flute they make out of the eagle bone, the eagle wing bone, you know. So after that first trip, I was really hooked, and I spent then my further studies, my PhD, I did on music in the region, and then I became particularly interested in the 12 Muqam. So I published a book about the working, the canonization, we call it, of the 12 Muqam. And I wrote a little bit about popular music, and, you know, I did interviews with some of the great musicians like Abdullah Abdurrahim, you know, the great pop musicians, and also some of the classical musicians, Ablis Shakir. I worked quite a lot with Sanaba Tursun. After I got my job in SOAS, we helped her to tour in Europe and in the States, and that was a really wonderful thing to get to know her very well. So, you know, it's been a long engagement with Uyghur culture, but very, very wonderful. Yeah.
How have you noticed, say, I would say the not just the deterioration, but also how the culture, when expressing it on stage nowadays, how has that changed? Because I've noticed a sort of, what's the word? Like the cultural funnel has been getting narrower and narrower. Like the poems you could read, or the songs that you could sing, or the art that you could express, that's been getting narrower and narrower. And we see this with artists like Sana Bertursun disappearing for a period of time, or others, artists and comedians and singers disappear, repop up again, or you know, for the work that they do. How has this changed over the years?
Well, you know, I mean, I never knew a time when it was easy. Really, you know, I mean, my some of my earliest engagements with Uyghur music and trying to help Uyghur musicians to tour abroad was actually trying to get Sanova and her brother Nur Mehmet Tursun, trying to invite them to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in America. It's like a really big festival. And that was in 2001. Yeah. And so we sent out the invitations, and they even got as far as Beijing to get on the plane to get to the States. And then at the very last minute, they were pulled off the plane, you know, and it was the usual, like, no explanation, no clarity about what the problem was with those two. So, I mean, that was back in 2001. And, you know, it was already at that time that China was starting to talk about the global war on terror, you know, and how its own campaigns against Uyghur, you know, what it called separatism in those days was, you know, an integral part of the global war on terror. So, you know, already Uyghur culture and Uyghur international cultural exchange was already at that time being implicated in all these kind of very increasingly brutal kind of political moves, you know. So really going even from that time. Hey Aslan, are you still there? Are we still going? Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're having a little bit of lag on the thing, but I'll keep going. So, you know, really things were, you know, they were never easy, but things clearly began to get much harder by 2013, 14, I think. You know, I mean, you can trace a very clear connection with the rise of Xi Jinping and his interest in the region and the treatment of Uyghur culture. No, so I mean, certainly by 2013, I was no longer getting visas to study culture in the region. By 2015, Zanova was no longer able to travel internationally. And by 2017, you know, we started getting these reports of all these major stars, musicians, dancers, comedians being detained, being locked up in the camps.
When we now see, because we don't see a total disappearance of Uyghur culture, you still see these happy Uyghurs dancing and sort of in the tourist industry, and sort of now China uses that for their own propaganda, saying, well, look at these Uyghurs here, interview these Uyghurs, they're dancing, they're happy, and look at their art and look at what they're doing. You sort of see this fake, this sort of this Uyghur culture put on for show. And where it's interesting that, yes, that's being used, but China now, in a way, they haven't, you know, they're weaponizing the Uyghur culture against activists like us.
I mean, that is a quite a big and interesting question, isn't it? And it is a very sad thing. You know, again, song and dance has been a label that's been stuck on the Uyghurs, as well as other kind of ethnic minority peoples in China, again, for decades. You know, it's always been a policy of the Chinese government to showcase these song and dance troupes and have happy, smiling Uyghurs singing and dancing and showing how happy they are to be part of China. You know, I mean, that goes back decades. And so, you know, it was very interesting in the early 2000s when, you know, things started to get so much worse within the Vetan. And you could see so many like more religiously inclined people starting to really reject music and dancing and say, you know, this is something that is imposed on us by the Chinese government. This is nothing to do with who we are. You know, this is not part of being a proper Uyghur Muslim. You know, and that I think was a very kind of difficult and sad thing for me to observe, because, you know, I've read a lot about the history, and I and also some of my students, you know, have spent time in the rural areas of the Vetan, spending time with village people and with very religious people. And so, you know, I've observed these many links with things that we call music, right? Like the mukam, the 12 mukam, and the kind of religious traditions that they still practice in these villages. So, you know, I spent time with ladies, Uyghur ladies in the villages, and listened to them reciting hikmet. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of hikmet, but these are the these are kind of sung poetry which are attributed to Yasawi, Hoj Ahmed Yasawi, the Central Asian like Sufi saint, I guess. And it's a very powerful thing to hear them recite and to see them cry and to be with them in the room when they're doing that. You know, some of my male students have spent time in Hotan working with like male Sufi groups, and he's listened to them singing, I guess, the poetry of Meshrep, which is very extraordinary spiritual poetry, you know, and you can actually find that same poetry in the in parts of the 12 Mukam. So, you know, what I learned from all this experience in these Uyghur communities is that you cannot separate things like called song and dance from the religious traditions of the Uyghur people. And so, you know, I think it is a particularly sad thing when people start rejecting the whole idea of music and Uyghur cultural traditions in favor of a you know, in favor of Islam, because there should be no disconnect in the tradition.
That's very interesting what you've brought up. Where do you see this going with regards to the culture? Do you see China continue? I mean, right now we're in a place where, as I mentioned before, China weaponizing the Uyghur culture against for their own benefit. Do you see this continuing, or do you also see even this being clamped down upon?
Yeah. So, you know, I began that discussion there talking about that whole tradition of getting Uyghurs to sing and dance and smile and show how happy they are to be part of China, and that has been a very, you know, it's been really deeply unpleasant to observe that happening over the last couple of years, right? When we know that communities are no longer able to gather together, people are no longer able to pursue their faith, and yet you see these images of Chinese tourist groups, you know, going to the gates of Kashgar, and smiling young Uyghur women coming out to dance for them, and musicians coming out to perform for them. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree that is a form of the weaponization of music. And we can even see that kind of process going on within the camps, right? We see, I mean, certainly there's a lot of use of singing Chinese revolutionary songs inside the camps, and people being made to sing about how much they love the Communist Party before they get their dinner. But we can even see aspects of Uyghur culture, Uyghur music being performed in the camps. I mean, when they sent in some kind of selected journalists from friendly countries, to actually spend some time in the camps, they actually produced a group of young Uyghurs who could sing mukam for them. I'm not sure how much of an artificial like kind of manufactured situation that was. I'm sure it was pretty fake, like everything. But you can just see then, the way that Uyghur culture is being used, instrumentalized in the hands of the authorities. And I imagine that will continue, because China is always quite sensitive to foreign complaints about what it does, right? I mean, it doesn't respond in a positive way, but it does often make these attempts to kind of window dress its brutal policies, right? And so I'm sure that we will see plenty more of Uyghur culture being used as window dressing for Chinese policies in the Uyghur region.
Now, when you hear news about that there is nothing going on or everything is a-okay, this shows to me that Chinese propaganda is working. Now, how can I say this? How would you explain to those people, or I'm sure you have been addressed with this issue, perhaps amongst your own constituents? What do you say to those around you when they show those clips of Uyghurs being happy and dancing and showing off their culture?
Well, I mean, I think it's very clear that these are people, these performers, they have very little choice about what they're doing. It's not hard to smile, isn't it? And it's very difficult to say no when there is the threat of the camps looming over you, when you're afraid for your relatives, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, so these are one of the clips that I've pulled up, and this is apparently, I mean, this looks quite normal and nice. Uyghurs being able to play, what looks to be a dormitory, and we can assume that this is probably one of the labor fields. It says here, talking about the Uyghur mashup in the camps, in the labor camps, but this really isn't normal for a bunch of grown men to be, housed where they are with all these instruments.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that clip before. I mean, I think we do need to focus on the abnormality of the situation. So I mean, these are people who are likely, released from the camps and are now working in conditions of forced labor away from their family. This is a very common situation that we've heard, and there's a great deal of evidence to show that's going on. So if these men have a little bit of leisure time, then that's great. On the other hand, is it a manufactured situation? I don't know. I mean, I think it's not really helpful to get into these kind of micro arguments about what's fake and what's real. I mean, it's very difficult on social media today. But I mean, we do clearly have overwhelming evidence. You only have to look at the multiple individual testimonies collected on organizations like Shahid Biz, the Uyghur Victims Database, or to see some of the testimonies that have been gathered by journalists in the West. So, I mean, these are games that have been played on social media by people who prefer to deny the truth. You know, there's a lot of engagement with fake news these days, and we just have to keep restating the facts and point people to the many detailed testimonies that are available, the detailed evidence that is available. You know, I mean, there are so many great organizations doing that work now.
Cultural genocide is not, you know, it's not labeled as seriously, or is not taken seriously by the United Nations. They don't actually they don't actually go and punish governments for causing or being part of cultural genocide. But that still is a very serious thing, and we've seen throughout history it does start off with cultural genocide, then leads to physical genocide. What do you say to those that go, oh well, it's only culture, or shouldn't cultural genocide be taken more seriously because it does lead to worse things?
Well, you know, I mean, I think cultural genocide is a powerful word, you know, and it is taken quite seriously. You know, there's no doubt. I mean, in a way, you know, I don't think that we can distinguish clearly between what is cultural genocide and what is genocide. If we term genocide the erasure of a whole people, you know, I mean, the erasure of the culture is also a key part of that, right? So, you know, I've been involved with quite a lot of academic exchanges now, and we've talked very carefully about what is meant by the term genocide. We did some very interesting comparative work in a recent conference that we did at Sheffield and at SOAS in London, and we have a special issue of the online journal Society in Space out now, which addresses some of these issues. So we brought in experts on the Rwandan genocide. We were looking in Myanmar. We were looking at the Rohingya. We were also talking about Serbia and the genocide inflicted there. And so, you know, I mean, I think it is very plausible that we can use the term genocide in the situation of East Turkestan now. I think, you know, there are very few people who would argue against the use of that term. I mean, I think a perhaps more crucial question is what do we gain by the use of the term genocide? Will that actually lead the UN to actually act on this situation? And unfortunately, that is rather less clear, right? I mean, even in the case of Myanmar, it seems that the regime is still in place, you know, and the poor Rohingya are still scattered and living in terrible situations in refugee camps, you know. So in a way, I think the terminology is less important than actual the international mechanisms and will to respond to these charges.
I want to go back to the sort of hikmet and the sort of the soundscapes that you've been able to capture. Are there any sort of messages that you hear or that you're able to decipher, or is there like an underlying message being brought up in their songs or in their poetry that, you know, if someone just on the surface heard it, they'll be like, and even understood the Uyghur language, they'd be like, oh, okay, it's about this. But is there like a recurring theme that goes on in their music?
That's a nice question. Yeah. You know, I mean, it is about the effective power of these songs, you know, and the experience in performance of people listening and reciting and crying, you know. And there are I guess a few kind of core messages that recur in this repertoire. I mean, for the women, it was very much about humility. you know, and being prepared for death, I suppose, you know, to meet your God and to understand how life goes past so quickly, you know, and to cultivate that sense of acceptance. You know, that was a very strong thing. Yeah, and for the Meshrep songs, you know, it's a little bit different, perhaps. I mean, you know, the men and the women are the same in the emotional response, but I think perhaps the Meshrep songs, there is more that sense of longing for the divine, you know, to actually that sense of, you know, the desire to reach out, to embrace the faith, and yeah.
As you mentioned, the reason why I mentioned those core messages about, you know, longing for the divine and you know, death and, you know, religion. Now, the last time you were there, we talked before, was in 2012. Could you imagine doing the work that you did? Would you be able to do the work that you have done if you were to be able to go back today? I mean, like imagine there's no more COVID. You're physically able to go there, but would you be able to do, or would those performances would they be able to be held the way that they used to be?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't really hold out hope of going back. You know, I mean, maybe over a long period of time things will ease off, but at the moment I have no hope. You know, I haven't had visa since 2012. I've spoken out, you know, so I mean, it's a very small sacrifice for me compared to the terrible suffering of my colleagues in the Uyghur region, you know. So I mean, that is just a small thing. I mean, the more important question you ask there is, you know, would those women be able to hold those gatherings at the moment? And clearly not. You know, even in 2012, it was already a very risky thing to do. You know, they were afraid of spies. They were afraid of being accused of, I don't know, like, I think back then they would have been accused of conducting feudal superstition. But by 2014, very clearly, what they were doing was being labelled as extremism. You know, and it's ironic in a way, you know, because I mean, their practice was very influenced by kind of Sufism, really, you know, which is not something that religious extremists tend to be very keen on, right? You know, but I mean, it is one of the great tragedies of this this whole situation, I think, because what those women were doing in that room was something that really was a very powerful force in holding the community together. You know, that gathering, the recitation, you know, it was something that was done for the souls of the departed, for the living relatives of the deceased, for people who were suffering. You know, the women, they played such an important role in keeping that village society together. And when the authorities, the Chinese government, decided to crack down on that practice and call it extremism, and, you know, and suggest that it was leading to terrorism, you know, what that really was an attack on the very fabric of Uyghur society. You know, so my book that's just come out, you know, the soundscapes of Uyghur Islam, I really try to explain why what those village women were doing was so important for the whole of Uyghur culture and society, you know, because it did play that very important role in stitching the fabric of society together, you know. And it was one of the early targets of the campaigns. You know, there was this terrible incident, which we still don't have all the details of, right? In oh, thank you. This terrible incident that we still don't know all the details of, where a group of women were arrested for conducting what the authorities called illegal religious activities, right? And they were taken off to the police station, and their men came back from the mosque and marched on the police station to complain, and that led to violence, right, and shootings, and several villages being engulfed in violence. So you can see really how these practices, these women's practices, were being so very clearly targeted by the authorities, and that was back in 2015. It was Ilishku, the incident in the township of Ilishku, I think in 2015 or 16.
We're sort of heading towards the end of our show, but I do want to take a question from the audience. It's quite an open question, and you can sort of answer it however you like. It says, why do you think many Western academics steer clear of openly criticizing the CCP? I guess, like you have. Perhaps there are people in your field that, that have steered away perhaps for money, or what? Why do you think that's the reason?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't really accuse people of steering away for directly for money,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are clearly people who perhaps are just starting out on their career as China experts, and they don't want to completely sacrifice that for a cause that perhaps they're not directly engaged with. I mean, I'm not going to judge people for that. It is hard to make these decisions,
Okay.
Yeah.
One more question from me. I was wondering, UNESCO, have you approached organizations like UNESCO about, for example, the destruction of shrines or the mosques? And have you gotten any result, or what was their response on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's another really great question. I've published a couple of things now, really trying to call on the UNESCO heritage organizations to do something about this situation, to speak out, to send some kind of investigation in. I mean, I think it is a very shocking thing that UNESCO continues to accept China's positioning as a regime that looks after Chinese culture. I mean, the Meshrep is still accepted by UNESCO as an item of heritage in need of safeguarding. The Muqam, the Meshrep are all on that list, and China has a very detailed action plan for safeguarding Uyghur Meshrep. And how UNESCO can continue to suggest that plan is underway in the face of all this overwhelming evidence that Uyghur culture and Uyghur communities are being destroyed. It really beggars belief. So I have spoken to some of the bureaucrats who work in UNESCO on these kind of issues, and they said, well, Rachel, they said, do you really think the Uyghurs would be happy if we took Meshrep off the list? Wouldn't that be another attack on Uyghur culture? And I did find that quite hard to answer. So I think that taking Uyghur culture off the list is perhaps not the way to go. But I mean, UNESCO should be really sending in, observer after observer and demanding to know what is really going on there. Otherwise, it's just not credible what that organization is trying to do.
I know I said that was the last question. I just got a question from WhatsApp, and you can see the question on the screen. How can we preserve Uyghur culture outside of the homeland? As you mentioned, it's going to be a very long time for our kids to be able to go back, and because that's where, I mean, growing up as a child myself, my mum would take me every 3 or 4 years to sort of get in that culture and be in me, and I thank her so much for that, because now I consider myself not just as an Australian but as a Uyghur as well. what would your advice be? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's another big and really important question, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and there are so many fantastic initiatives going on, you know, across the Uyghur diaspora, you know. So, I mean, I have the most huge respect for people who are teaching the language and promoting culture in other ways. You know, I mean, there are quite a few like music groups outside of the VTN now, aren't there, which you know, are all doing great work. There are people like teaching dance. So all of that is really important. You know, one of my more recent projects, since I couldn't get back into East Turkestan, I started spending more time in the Central Asian states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, like working with Uyghur communities there. And, you know, of course, I mean, they're not huge communities there. And the culture that they preserve is not as rich as what you can find in the homeland. But nonetheless, you know, I mean, it's still a very significant place for the safeguarding and the transmission of Uyghur culture. And what I really like about Kazakhstan is the way that Uyghur communities have had enough kind of autonomy to actually, you know, preserve their culture for themselves and to use it really as a way to strengthen their community. You know, so we've been doing a big project on Uyghur Meshrep in Kazakhstan, like working with some academics and community leaders there, like Karolin Makhpirov and Arblek Kamalov in Turan University. And that has just been a fantastic project, you know, because the revival of Meshrep in Kazakhstan has just been a very impressive project over the past few years. So, you know, if anyone's interested in how they've been going about that, we have a website up called meshrep.uk, and you can see some videos and some writing about that. So, you know, that I think is a very different way of thinking about Uyghur heritage and a very different way of using it actually to promote Uyghur culture, language, and to make Uyghur communities strong. So, you know, if I feel hopeful, it is because of those people I met in Kazakhstan.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Rachel, for, you know, spending your time with us, you know, giving us your expertise, your experience, what's been happening. Please, everybody, if you can, you know, if you're able to purchase Rachel's latest book, I believe, is this your latest book?
It is, yeah.
It's on Amazon, and I'm sure it's on other platforms as well. Make sure you are following Rachel. You know, you do such amazing work. There are lots more questions that people are asking, and perhaps you could sort of answer them, you know, in your own time. But thank you so much. Have a happy New Year to your family.
And happy New Year to you, Arslan. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to engage with your excellent series here.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank my guests for joining me today. And until next time, everybody, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.